Picture this. A boy is born on a cold December morning in a small seaside town in Italy. His own father looks down at him, and instead of joy, he feels dread. He turns to the people around him and says something no father should ever say about his own child, that anything born from him and this woman would grow up to be a monster, a danger to everyone around it. That boy grows up to rule the most powerful empire on earth. He will marry 3 women and stand accused of destroying all 3. He will murder his own mother, and then, according to the men who wrote his story, stand over her body and coldly remark on her appearance. He will burn a city or be blamed for a fire he may never have started, and then point the finger at a small, strange new religious group called the Christians, unleashing a wave of persecution that would echo for centuries. He will build a palace so extravagant, so soaked in gold that Romans joked their entire city had become one man's private property. And in the end, hunted by his own soldiers, abandoned by the Senate that once celebrated him as a golden-haired boy emperor, he will die alone in a stranger's villa, whispering words that historians still argue over today. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. History remembers him as Emperor Nero. Was he born a monster? Or did Rome and his own mother make him into one? Think about it this way. Every tyrant in history was once, at some point, simply a child. A child with a mother, a father, a home, a set of lessons taught and lessons ignored. Somewhere between the cradle and the crown, something happens. A choice, a pressure, a betrayal, a taste of power that never quite lets go once it's been given. What happened to Nero between that cold December birth and the bloody final hours of his reign is one of the most complete case studies history has ever given us of exactly that transformation. By the end of this story, you will have to decide for yourself. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this so far, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it right there as you're hearing this? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's go back before Nero was even born, because to understand the monster or the man, you first have to understand the world that made him. Chapter 1. The world before Nero. Rome, in the decades before Nero's birth, was not a peaceful place. It only looked that way from a distance. Picture the city itself for a moment, because it helps to understand the stage on which this entire story would eventually play out. Rome, by this period, was already home to roughly 1 million people, sprawling across 7 hills, its skyline, a chaotic mix of towering temples, crowded marketplaces, and multi-story wooden apartment blocks packed so tightly together that fire, disease, and crime spread through its poorer districts with terrifying ease. At its center stood the Forum, the beating heart of Roman public life, where senators debated, merchants traded, and ordinary citizens gathered to hear news, gossip, and the occasional public execution. Above it all, on the Palatine Hill, sat the growing complex of imperial residences. The origin, in fact, of our modern word palace, derived directly from that same hill. This was a city of staggering contrasts, even before Nero ever set foot in it. Extraordinary wealth pressed up against grinding poverty, marble temples towering over squalid tenements, a population that could be whipped into adoring, roaring crowds at the games one week and simmering, dangerous unrest the next. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place capable of producing both a beloved celebrity emperor and a hated tyrant within the very same reign. Sometimes, within the very same year. By this point, the Roman Republic, the system of elected consuls and senators that had governed Rome for nearly 500 years, was dead. In its place stood something new, something the Romans themselves weren't entirely sure how to describe. An empire ruled by one man, wrapped in the language of tradition, but powered underneath by fear, loyalty, and blood. That one man had been Augustus. Augustus, born Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, had spent decades clawing his way to the top of a Rome torn apart by civil war. He had defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He had outlasted every rival. And when the fighting was finally over, he did something remarkably clever. He didn't call himself a king. Kings were hated in Rome. Instead, he called himself princeps, first citizen, and quietly built an entire system of imperial power underneath that modest title. He restored temples. He commissioned poets. He gave Rome roads, aqueducts, and decades of relative peace after a century of war. Historians would later call this era the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But peace at the top of an empire is a fragile thing, because underneath the marble and the poetry, one question hung over everything: who comes next? Augustus had no surviving son, and in a family as large, as ambitious, and as venomous as his, that single fact would poison Roman politics for the next century. After years of maneuvering, deaths that conveniently cleared rivals out of the way, and forced marriages designed purely to produce heirs, the throne eventually passed to Tiberius, Augustus's stepson, a brilliant but deeply reluctant ruler who, according to ancient writers, grew paranoid and reclusive, eventually abandoning Rome altogether to rule from the island of Capri, while trusted men back in the capital carried out purges in his name. Then came Caligula. Young, charismatic, and initially adored by the Roman public, Caligula's reign is remembered, fairly or not, as one of the most disturbing chapters in imperial history. Ancient sources accuse him of cruelty, of extravagance, of treating the machinery of the state as his personal plaything. Whether all of these stories are true is something historians still debate. Many were written by men with every reason to make him look as monstrous as possible. But what is certain is this: in AD 41, members of his own guard turned on him and cut him down. After the chaos of his assassination, the imperial family, desperate, panicked, and unsure who would seize power next, settled on an unlikely figure: Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man many in Rome had dismissed for years as a stammering, limping embarrassment to the family. Claudius surprised everyone. He turned out to be a capable, if politically vulnerable, emperor, expanding the empire, reforming the courts, and governing with more competence than anyone had expected. But here is the thing you need to understand about being Emperor of Rome in this era. It did not matter how well you governed. What mattered was who was plotting against you and who was plotting for you inside your own household. This was a world where wives poisoned husbands to protect their sons, where advisors whispered accusations of treason to eliminate rivals, where being born into the imperial family was not a guarantee of safety, it was a target painted on your back. This was the Rome that Nero was about to be born into, a world already soaked in political blood long before he ever drew his first breath. Think, for a moment, about what it actually meant to live inside this family. Outside the palace walls, ordinary Romans saw marble temples, triumphal processions, and coins stamped with the faces of gods and heroes. But inside the palace walls, the picture looked very different. Husbands and wives watched each other for signs of betrayal. Mothers calculated which of their sons might survive long enough to inherit power, and which might need to be quietly removed from the board entirely. Brothers eyed brothers, uncles eyed nephews, and every single one of them understood on some level that the difference between becoming emperor and becoming a footnote in someone else's reign could come down to nothing more than a single poisoned meal, a single whispered accusation, a single moment of hesitation. This was not a family in the way most of us understand family. It was a court, a battlefield disguised as a household. And the prize at stake was not simply wealth or title, it was control over the entire known world, from the fog-soaked hills of Britain in the north to the deserts of Egypt in the south, to the mountains of the Caucasus in the east. Augustus himself had understood this danger perhaps better than anyone. He spent the final decades of his life obsessively trying to secure a stable line of succession, adopting grandsons, promoting stepsons, arranging marriages, and watching, one after another, his chosen heirs die young, sometimes under circumstances suspicious enough that later historians openly wondered whether his own wife, Livia, had a hand in clearing the path for her son Tiberius. Do you see the pattern forming here? Long before Nero was even a thought in anyone's mind, the House of the Caesars had already established its rules. Ambition was rewarded, loyalty was negotiable, and the family that ruled the world from a hill in Rome had already proven, generation after generation, that it was entirely capable of devouring its own. By the time Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius had each taken their turn on the throne, one lesson had been repeated so many times that it had become almost a law of nature inside the palace. The person sitting closest to you at dinner might be the very person planning your downfall. Keep that lesson in mind, because it is about to be inherited in full by an infant boy who has not yet even opened his eyes. Chapter 2. Nero's birth. On December 15th in the year AD 37, in the small coastal town of Antium, what we today call Anzio, a short distance south of Rome, a boy was born who would one day rule the known world. His name at birth was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. His father was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man from an old and distinguished Roman family, but one whom ancient writers describe as arrogant, short-tempered, and at times outright violent. He was not, by most accounts, a man anyone particularly liked. Suetonius records that he had, at various points in his life, been charged with treason, adultery, and even the killing of one of his own freedmen along a public road simply for refusing to drink as much as he demanded. A portrait of a man whose temperament, whatever else it says about the family Nero was born into, hardly suggests a household defined by warmth or stability. His mother, however, was a different story entirely, and arguably the single most important figure in Nero's entire life. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself, and she carried within her, from the very beginning, an ambition so intense that ancient historians would spend centuries trying to describe it. According to Roman tradition, and we should say clearly, this is a story passed down through ancient sources, not something that can be verified. When friends came to congratulate Gnaeus on the birth of his son, he responded with something chilling. He said that any child born from him and Agrippina could only turn out to be detestable and a public danger. We don't know if he actually said this. It may have been added later by historians writing with the benefit of hindsight, eager to plant an omen at the very start of Nero's story. Roman writers loved a good omen, but true or not, the line has survived for nearly 2,000 years for a reason, because so many people, looking back at what Nero became, found it impossible not to believe. A father's curse, a mother's ambition, and a child caught in between. That was the beginning of Nero's story. But let's slow down and actually sit inside this moment for a second, because it tells us so much about what was coming. Antium, where Nero was born, was not some remote backwater. It was a fashionable coastal retreat, a place where wealthy Roman families kept villas overlooking the sea, escaping the noise and heat of the capital. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place a family like this would choose to give birth to an heir, comfortable, private, and far enough from the political churn of Rome to feel, for a moment, safe. But safety, in this family, was always an illusion. Agrippina was 21 years old when she gave birth to her only child. She had already lived through more political upheaval than most people experience in a lifetime. The fall of her father, the chaotic and increasingly erratic reign of her own brother, Caligula, the constant grinding awareness that being born a descendant of Augustus made you simultaneously one of the most privileged people alive and one of the most watched. Every move she made, every alliance she formed, every child she bore was being measured by the rest of the family as a potential threat or a potential asset. From the very moment Nero was born, he was not simply a baby. He was a piece on the board, a living claim to power, wrapped in swaddling cloth, whose value would only grow as the years passed and the throne changed hands again and again above his head. Ancient writers centuries later loved to frame moments like this one as omens, signs planted by the gods or by fate itself, hinting at the disaster to come. A father's bitter prediction, a birth under a family already stained by suspicion and betrayal. It made for a compelling story, and it still does today. But strip away the mythology for a second, and what you're left with is something far more human, and in some ways, far more unsettling. A child born into an environment where love and ambition were never fully separable, where his own mother's affection for him could never quite be untangled from what he represented to her politically. That tangled inheritance, a mother's fierce devotion, twisted together with naked political calculation, would define nearly every major decision of Nero's early life. It's worth pausing, too, on the name itself. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was not simply a random string of Latin words. Roman naming conventions carried real weight, tracing lineage, marking status, signaling to everyone who heard it exactly which family and which claims to power stood behind the person carrying it. The name Ahenobarbus itself, translating roughly to Bronzebeard, referred to a family legend claiming that the god Castor and Pollux had once appeared to an ancestor and, as a sign of favor, turned his beard the color of bronze. The Domitii Ahenobarbi were an old, proud senatorial family, well established for generations before Agrippina ever married into it. But the name he was born with would not be the name history remembers him by. That transformation, from Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus to the emperor we call Nero, would come later, tied directly to his adoption into an entirely different family, one with a far more dangerous claim to power than the one he was born into. We'll get to that moment soon. For now, simply remember, the boy born in Antium on that December day was not yet Nero. He would have to be remade first, politically, legally, and in name, before the world would come to know him by the name history has never forgotten. Chapter 3. Childhood. Nero's early childhood was anything but stable. His father died when Nero was still quite young, leaving him without the one parent who, whatever his flaws, at least gave him a legitimate, unthreatened position in Roman society. Worse still, his mother Agrippina soon found herself on the wrong side of imperial politics. Under Caligula's chaotic and increasingly paranoid rule, Agrippina was accused of conspiracy and exiled. For a time, young Nero was effectively raised apart from his own mother, passed between relatives, his future far from certain. Imagine that for a moment. A small child, part of the most powerful family in the world, and yet with no guarantee of safety, status, or even survival. This was simply what it meant to be born into the house of the Caesars. Eventually, fortunes shifted again, as they constantly did in this family, and Agrippina returned from exile. Nero's education began in earnest, and it's here that one of the most fascinating relationships in his entire life begins. Because it's around this time that Nero was given a new tutor. His name was Seneca the Younger. Seneca was one of Rome's great Stoic philosophers, a man who wrote extensively about restraint, about virtue, about the discipline required to master one's own worst impulses. He had survived his own brush with disaster. Caligula had reportedly considered having him executed, and he had later been exiled himself under Claudius before being recalled specifically to shape the mind of young Nero. Think about the irony sitting right at the center of this arrangement. One of history's great teachers of moderation and self-control, assigned to raise a boy who would one day become remembered as one of history's great examples of excess and cruelty. Seneca tried. Ancient sources suggest he genuinely worked to instill in Nero the values of justice, moderation, mercy. For a time, it even seemed to work. But keep this image in your mind as we move forward in the story. A Stoic philosopher, quietly teaching a child self-restraint, while all around that same child, his mother was playing an entirely different game, one of ambition, manipulation, and raw political power. Two very different teachers, pulling in two very different directions. And we're about to watch which one wins. Let's paint a fuller picture of what those early years actually looked like. When Nero's father died, the boy was left with almost nothing. Ancient sources note that his inheritance was seized by Caligula, leaving him dependent entirely on the goodwill, or lack thereof, of whoever held power at the time. For a brief, dangerous stretch, he was raised by an aunt, while his mother sat in exile on a small island, cut off from her son entirely, unable to protect him or guide him. Picture that. A small child, already fatherless, temporarily motherless too, living on the uncertain charity of relatives, while somewhere out on the water, his mother waited and plotted her return. When Agrippina finally did come back into favor, pardoned after Caligula's death and the rise of Claudius, she wasted no time reasserting control over her son's upbringing. And this is when Seneca enters the story. Seneca was, by this point, one of the most celebrated intellectual figures in Rome. He had written extensively on ethics, on the management of anger, on how a wise person confronts fear and death without losing their composure. He had personally survived Caligula's court, where a simple word from the emperor could have ended his life, and he had endured 8 long years of exile on the island of Corsica under Claudius, accused of an affair with a member of the imperial family, a charge many historians believe was politically motivated rather than true. When Agrippina arranged for his recall from exile specifically to tutor her son, it was, in many ways, a masterstroke of political theater. She was placing one of Rome's most respected moral minds directly in charge of shaping the future emperor's character, a move that gave her own son's future rule an air of legitimacy and wisdom, regardless of what actually happened behind closed doors. For Seneca's part, ancient sources suggest he approached the task seriously. He wrote treatises specifically framed around guiding a young ruler, essays on clemency, on the responsibilities that came with holding power over the lives of others. He seems to have genuinely believed that a well-educated, philosophically grounded young man could rule with wisdom rather than cruelty, breaking the pattern set by Tiberius and Caligula before him. For a while, walking through the palace, you might have seen the two of them together, the aging philosopher and the golden-haired boy, deep in discussion about duty, about justice, about the burdens of power. Hold on to that image, because as the years pass and as the boy grows into a man, that image will become almost unrecognizable. It's also worth understanding just how precarious young Nero's position truly was during those years before his mother's return from exile. With his mother banished and his father dead, the boy who would one day rule the world was, for a time, genuinely vulnerable, dependent on relatives who had no particular reason to protect him, living under an emperor, Caligula, whose paranoia and cruelty were becoming legendary even by the standards of a family already accustomed to political violence. Ancient sources suggest that Caligula at various points mocked the boy, and there was no guarantee whatsoever that young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus would survive to adulthood at all, let alone rise to become emperor himself. It was only the swift and unexpected fall of Caligula, cut down by his own guard in AD 41, and the equally unexpected rise of Claudius that changed the trajectory of the boy's entire life. Agrippina, pardoned and recalled once Claudius took power, returned to find her son alive, but with his position in the world still far from secure. It was from this fragile starting point, a fatherless, nearly forgotten child, dependent entirely on the shifting fortunes of an unpredictable dynasty, that Agrippina began the long, patient campaign that would eventually place a crown on her son's head. Chapter 4. Agrippina's Ambition. If Nero's childhood was unstable, his mother's rise back to power was the exact opposite: calculated, relentless, and terrifyingly effective. This chapter of the story plays out like a political thriller, because that is essentially what it was. After Claudius became emperor and after the downfall of his previous wife, Agrippina maneuvered her way into position to become his new wife. There was just one small complication. Claudius was her uncle. Marriage between an uncle and niece was considered scandalous, even by Roman standards. Agrippina didn't let that stop her. Through political pressure and public persuasion, the marriage went ahead anyway. Once she was empress, Agrippina moved quickly. She convinced Claudius to adopt her son Nero, formally bringing him into the line of succession. She worked to elevate Nero's status above Britannicus, Claudius's own biological son, and the boy who, under normal circumstances, should have been the unquestioned heir to the throne. Step by step, marriage by marriage, adoption by adoption, Agrippina rebuilt her son's path to the throne from almost nothing into the strongest claim in the empire. And then, in AD 54, Claudius suddenly died. Ancient historians, including Tacitus and Suetonius, two of our main sources for this entire period, report a persistent rumor that Agrippina poisoned her own husband, allegedly using a dish of mushrooms in order to clear the way for her son to take the throne before Britannicus came of age. We need to be honest with you here. This cannot be proven. Modern historians remain divided. It's entirely possible Claudius died of natural causes, and that the poisoning story was invented or exaggerated by people hostile to Agrippina, eager to paint her as a murderous, scheming woman, a common trope used against powerful women in Roman histories written almost exclusively by men. But true or not, the timing was extraordinary, and the outcome was undeniable. Let's walk through exactly how calculated this campaign really was, because it's worth appreciating just how skillfully Agrippina played a game where a single misstep could have cost her everything. First, she secured the marriage to Claudius himself. No small feat, given the scandal of marrying her own uncle. She achieved it partly through public persuasion, partly by aligning herself with powerful freedmen inside the palace who managed Claudius's household and had his ear on a daily basis. Once she was empress, she began systematically placing her own loyalists into positions of influence, easing out rivals and ensuring that anyone who might advocate for Britannicus's claim to the throne found themselves gradually pushed out of favor. Then came the adoption. In AD 50, Claudius formally adopted Nero, changing his name and folding him fully into the line of imperial succession. From that moment forward, Nero was no longer simply a well-connected relative of the emperor. He was, officially, a potential heir, standing on nearly equal footing with Claudius's own biological son. Agrippina then went further still, arranging Nero's marriage to Claudia Octavia, Claudius's own daughter, binding Nero even more tightly into the direct bloodline of the emperor, and simultaneously isolating Britannicus, whose own sister was now, in effect, aligned with his rival. Piece by piece, year by year, Agrippina dismantled Britannicus's advantage and built her son's claim up from nothing into the single strongest position in the empire. And then, Claudius died. Within hours of Claudius's death, the path was cleared. Praetorian Guard commanders, men whose loyalty Agrippina had carefully cultivated in advance, presented Nero to the assembled soldiers as the new emperor before Britannicus's supporters had any real chance to organize an alternative. The Senate, faced with a fait accompli and a Praetorian Guard already shouting Nero's name, ratified the decision almost immediately. It was, by any measure, one of the most efficient successions in the entire history of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, achieved not through open warfare, but through years of patient, ruthless positioning by a mother determined to see her son on the throne. Compare this for a moment to how badly things might have gone. Britannicus, at the time of Claudius's death, was only 13 years old, still legally a minor, unable to assume the throne even had the Senate and Guard supported him. Had Agrippina not spent years methodically building Nero's claim, isolating Britannicus's supporters, and cultivating loyalty among the Praetorian Guard commanders, the succession could easily have descended into exactly the kind of prolonged, bloody civil conflict that would eventually engulf Rome after Nero's own death, decades later. Agrippina's meticulous groundwork was, in a very real sense, what spared Rome that fate in AD 54, even as it planted the seeds for a very different kind of tragedy still to come. A 17-year-old boy named Nero was about to become the most powerful person on earth, and the woman who had engineered every step of that rise fully expected to rule right alongside him. Chapter 5. Becoming Emperor. 17 years old. Stop and sit with that number for a moment because it's easy to breeze past it. 17. An age at which most people today are still finishing high school, still figuring out who they even want to be. And Nero was being handed control of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. And yet, remarkably, the transition went smoothly. The Senate welcomed him. Crowds in Rome celebrated. There was no immediate uprising, no rival claimants storming the palace. The teenage emperor stood before Rome and promised justice, promised fairness, promised a reign guided by wisdom rather than cruelty. Of course, everyone watching understood the truth behind the scenes. Nero himself was in no position to actually govern an empire. He was a teenager. The real power in these early years rested with two men. The first was Seneca, his old tutor, now his chief advisor and speechwriter, the man who literally put words into the young emperor's mouth for his public addresses. The second was Burrus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for the emperor's protection, and a man widely respected for his discipline and integrity. Together, Seneca and Burrus effectively ran the empire in Nero's name. And for a while, historians often call this period the Golden Beginning. It actually worked. Decisions were measured. Punishments were fair. The chaos and paranoia of Caligula's reign seemed like a distant, ugly memory. Rome allowed itself, cautiously, to hope. There's a detail from this early period that historians often point to as a symbol of just how promising things seemed at first. When asked, early in his reign, to sign a routine execution order, a mundane, almost bureaucratic act that emperors before him had performed without a second thought, Nero is said to have sighed and remarked that he wished he had never learned to write, so that he wouldn't have to sign such a thing at all. Whether or not that specific line is authentic, it captures something real about the mood surrounding the young emperor in those first months. Here was a ruler who seemed, at least outwardly, reluctant to embrace the darker mechanics of imperial power. A ruler who spoke about mercy rather than fear. The Senate, still recovering from the paranoid purges of Tiberius and Caligula, found this enormously reassuring. Nero delivered a speech, largely written by Seneca, promising to restore some of the Senate's traditional authority, to separate his own household finances from the finances of the state, and to govern with restraint rather than caprice. For a Senate that had spent decades walking on eggshells around unpredictable, dangerous emperors, this was close to a dream scenario. A young, malleable ruler, guided by trusted advisors, seemingly committed to a return of dignity and order. Behind the palace walls, of course, a far more complicated reality was already taking shape. Agrippina, who had orchestrated her son's rise to power with such precision, fully expected to govern alongside him, perhaps even above him. Early coins from Nero's reign are remarkably telling on this point. Some depict mother and son facing one another, nearly equal in size and prominence, an almost unprecedented image for a Roman emperor to share with anyone, let alone his own mother. That arrangement, as we'll see, was never going to last. But for these first fragile months, the empire held its breath and dared to hope that the house of the Caesars had finally produced a ruler who might break the cycle of fear that had defined it for 2 generations. Picture, for a moment, the funeral of Claudius and the transition of power that followed it, because Roman writers describe the scene with real care. Claudius was given a state funeral befitting an emperor, complete with formal deification, the Senate voting to recognize him officially as a god, joining Augustus in the ranks of divine emperors. Nero himself delivered the funeral eulogy, a speech ancient sources credit largely to Seneca's pen, praising his adoptive father's wisdom and foresight, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the far messier reality of how the succession had actually been arranged. Then came the presentation to the Praetorian Guard, the moment that, in practical terms, mattered far more than any Senate vote. The commander of the guard presented Nero to the assembled soldiers, and according to Suetonius, the young emperor's first act was to promise a substantial monetary donative to every soldier present, a customary but crucial gesture that helped cement the loyalty of the men who, quite literally, held his life in their hands. The soldiers, satisfied, hailed him as emperor, and from that moment forward, the practical machinery of the transition was essentially complete, regardless of anything the Senate might formally deliberate afterward. Chapter 6. The Good Years. It's important that we don't rush past this part of the story because it's the part most people forget entirely when they hear the name Nero. For several years, Nero was, by most measures, a popular ruler. He lowered certain taxes. He funded lavish public games that thrilled ordinary Romans, chariot races, theatrical performances, spectacles that gave the average citizen genuine joy and entertainment. He poured attention and money into the arts, into music, into theater, subjects that fascinated him personally far more than the dry mechanics of law and administration. Ordinary Romans, not senators, not aristocrats, but the everyday people filling the stands at public games, largely adored him. He was young, handsome by most descriptions, generous with entertainment, and seemingly uninterested in the kind of brutal purges that had defined his predecessors. This is a crucial point to understand. Nero was not born wearing the mask of a tyrant. For years, he was something closer to a beloved celebrity emperor, a young man the crowds cheered for. Consider what daily life looked like for an ordinary Roman during these years. You might rise early, make your way through crowded streets to the Circus Maximus, and spend the afternoon watching chariot teams race at breakneck speed in front of 200,000 roaring spectators. A spectacle Nero funded and clearly relished attending himself, often sitting close enough to the action that the crowd could see his own excitement mirror theirs. In the evenings, there might be theatrical performances, comedies, and tragedies staged in venues across the city, or musical competitions that Nero personally funded and, increasingly, personally wished to participate in. Bread was subsidized. Entertainment was abundant. For the average Roman, whose daily concerns revolved far more around the price of grain and the quality of public spectacle than around the delicate politics of the Senate floor, these were genuinely good years. Nero also displayed in this period a kind of populist instinct that set him apart from more traditionally aristocratic emperors. He mingled, disguised among the crowds at night, a practice ancient writers describe with a mixture of scandal and grudging fascination, visiting taverns, brawling in the streets, immersing himself in the pleasures of ordinary Roman nightlife in a way no emperor before him had dared. Suetonius describes these nighttime outings in vivid detail. Nero and his companions moving through the city under cover of darkness, stealing goods from shops, ambushing pedestrians returning home from dinners, and, on at least one occasion, tossing a victim into a sewer for the sheer amusement of it. Remarkably, he reportedly suffered no serious consequences for any of this during these years, in part because so few people dared to retaliate against a man who might, for all they knew in the darkness, turn out to be the emperor himself, and in part because those who did strike back and later discovered their opponent's true identity found themselves forced into groveling apology rather than justice. To the Senate, this behavior was undignified, even alarming. But to the crowds who packed the stands at his games, who received his subsidized grain, who watched him laugh and cheer alongside them, rather than observing from a distant, untouchable throne, Nero seemed, for a time, like something Rome had never quite had before, an emperor of the people. That popularity would matter enormously later in his reign, when the Senate and the aristocracy turned against him almost completely. Because even at the very end, ordinary Romans in some provinces continued to mourn him, and rumors would circulate for years afterward that Nero was not truly dead, that he would one day return. Let's take a moment to actually step inside one of these games, because it helps explain exactly why the crowds loved him so much. Imagine arriving at dawn to secure a good seat at the Circus Maximus, a stadium so vast it could hold roughly 250,000 spectators, larger than almost any sports venue built in the 2,000 years since. Vendors move through the crowd selling wine, roasted meat, and sweetened bread. The air fills with dust and noise, long before the races even begin. Then the chariots burst from the starting gates, four-horse teams thundering around a track lined with towering monuments and obelisks, the crowd roaring for their favorite racing faction, colors flying, fortunes won and lost on the outcome of a single race. Nero, according to ancient sources, didn't simply fund these spectacles from a distance. He attended personally, sat close to the action, and reportedly displayed genuine, unrestrained enthusiasm, cheering, wagering, celebrating alongside the very crowds who had come to watch. For an emperor to behave this way, rather than observing with the detached, untouchable dignity that Roman tradition expected of its rulers, was unusual. To the aristocracy, it looked undignified. To the ordinary Roman sitting in the stands, it looked like an emperor who genuinely understood and shared in their joy. He also introduced new kinds of entertainment that Rome had rarely, if ever, seen before, including athletic games modeled on Greek traditions, combining music, poetry, and athletic competition in ways that broke from purely Roman spectacle. Whatever the aristocracy thought of these Greek-influenced innovations, ordinary audiences seemed to embrace the variety and novelty they brought to public life. Nero also established what became known as the Juvenalia, a festival celebrating his own coming of age, and later, the Neronia, a recurring competition modeled explicitly on Greek athletic and artistic festivals, held every 5 years and featuring contests in poetry, oratory, and music, alongside more traditional athletic events. These innovations reflected something genuine about Nero's own tastes and passions, well beyond mere political calculation. He seems to have held a real, lifelong fascination with Greek culture, viewing it as more refined and sophisticated than the martial, austere traditions Roman aristocrats prized so highly. For ordinary citizens, these festivals offered fresh spectacle and novelty. For the traditional aristocracy, they represented one more small worrying sign that their young emperor's priorities lay somewhere other than the dignified, restrained conduct expected of Roman leadership. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because right now, in these golden years, none of that darkness had arrived yet. Something, however, was quietly beginning to shift. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. Every great fall needs a hinge point, a moment where the story quietly pivots from one direction toward another. For Nero, that hinge point arrived with the death of Burrus. Burrus, the steady commander of the Praetorian Guard, had been one of the two men holding the empire together while Nero grew into his role. When Burrus died, the cause debated even by ancient sources, with some suggesting illness and others hinting at something more sinister. One of the two great stabilizing forces in Nero's reign disappeared. At almost the same time, his relationship with Seneca began to deteriorate. The old philosopher's calls for restraint, for moderation, for careful governance increasingly grated against a young emperor who was beginning to feel the full, intoxicating weight of absolute power. And absolute power, especially when it arrives young, does something to a person. Ancient historians describe a growing paranoia settling into Nero during this period, a hunger for control that had not been so visible before. Flatterers began to surround him, courtiers who understood that the fastest way to rise at court was not to challenge the emperor's worst impulses, but to feed them. Whether this was pure political drift, or whether something deeper was shifting in Nero's own mind, historians have speculated for centuries about possible psychological changes, though we should be cautious here, since diagnosing a man who died nearly 2,000 years ago is more guesswork than science. Something was undeniably changing. The golden beginning was ending. To understand exactly how this shift happened, it helps to look at the specific pressures converging on Nero at once. He was now in his early 20s, no longer a boy who needed guardians to speak on his behalf, but a grown man increasingly aware that two other people, Seneca and, before his death, Burrus, were widely credited by the Roman public for whatever success his reign had achieved. That is a difficult thing for any ruler to sit with, the suspicion that the praise he receives is not truly his own. At the same time, his mother Agrippina had not stepped back gracefully. She continued to involve herself in matters of state, continued to expect deference from her son in front of foreign dignitaries and Roman officials alike, continued, in short, to behave as though she were co-ruler of the empire she had built for him. For a young emperor, hungry to prove his own authority, this was becoming intolerable. Into this tense environment stepped a new figure who would come to symbolize everything Seneca and Burrus had tried to prevent. A Praetorian prefect named Tigellinus, a man ancient sources describe as ambitious, ruthless, and utterly willing to encourage Nero's worst impulses if it meant winning his favor. Where Seneca counseled restraint, Tigellinus whispered indulgence. Where Burrus had insisted on discipline within the guard, Tigellinus offered loyalty without question, so long as Nero's pleasures and Nero's enemies were both attended to. This is the pattern historians point to again and again when trying to explain how young rulers, raised with the best of intentions, sometimes curdle into something far darker, remove the steady hands and replace them with voices eager to tell the ruler exactly what he wants to hear. Burrus's death removed one steady hand entirely. Seneca's declining influence weakened the other, and Tigellinus filled the vacuum with encouragement rather than restraint. There's a particularly telling anecdote from this period that historians often point to as an early sign of the shift already underway. Nero reportedly began experimenting in these years with a habit of roaming the streets of Rome at night in disguise, accompanied by a group of young companions, seeking out brawls, harassing shopkeepers, and generally indulging in the kind of reckless behavior that would have gotten an ordinary young Roman arrested, but which the emperor's companions made sure was quietly smoothed over. On at least one occasion, according to Tacitus, these nighttime excursions escalated into genuine violence, with a senator reportedly beaten badly enough by Nero's group that the emperor found himself forced to make a public apology to smooth over the scandal. What's striking about this story is not simply the recklessness itself. Plenty of wealthy young Roman men engaged in similar behavior, but what it reveals about the widening gap between Nero's private conduct and the dignified, restrained public image Seneca had worked so hard to construct around him. The philosopher's carefully crafted speeches, praising justice and moderation, were being delivered by a young man who was, by night, increasingly indulging exactly the kind of impulsive, consequence-free behavior that absolute power makes possible. This is also the point in the story where it's worth pausing to address a question that historians and increasingly modern psychologists looking back at the ancient record have asked for generations. Was something deeper going on inside Nero's mind beyond simple moral failing or political circumstance? We have to be careful here, because it is genuinely impossible to diagnose with any real confidence a man who has been dead for nearly 2,000 years based solely on second-hand accounts written by his political enemies. That said, some patterns in the ancient descriptions of his behavior, a hunger for constant admiration, a fragile and easily wounded sense of self-importance, an inability to tolerate criticism or rivals, dramatic and impulsive swings between generosity and cruelty, have led some modern commentators to speculate about traits associated with narcissistic personality patterns, though this remains speculation rather than anything resembling a clinical conclusion. What we can say with more confidence is this: Nero was a young man raised almost entirely within an environment that offered him nearly unlimited power, nearly unlimited flattery, and almost no meaningful consequences for his actions, from an age when most people are still developing basic emotional regulation and impulse control. Whatever innate temperament he was born with, that environment would have been enough on its own to reshape almost anyone's behavior over time. The Roman historian Tacitus himself seemed to sense this, writing with something close to genuine tragedy about how a promising young ruler could be worn down, piece by piece, by the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the constant whisper of men who benefited from encouraging his worst impulses. And what came next would shock all of Rome. Chapter 8. Murder of Britannicus. Remember Britannicus? Claudius's biological son, the boy who, by blood, should have inherited the throne before Nero ever had a claim to it. He was still alive, still young, still, in the eyes of many Romans, a potential rival, a living reminder that Nero's own claim to power had been built through adoption and political maneuvering rather than direct birthright. As Britannicus approached the age where he might legally come of age and be seen as a genuine alternative to Nero's rule, tension in the palace grew unbearable. And then, at a banquet, Britannicus suddenly collapsed and died. Ancient sources are blunt about what they believed happened. They accuse Nero of poisoning him right there at the dinner table in front of witnesses who were too afraid to react. We cannot prove this beyond doubt today. Sudden deaths at Roman banquets were tragically common and could stem from all sorts of causes. But the political convenience of Britannicus's death was impossible for contemporaries to ignore. A potential rival, gone at the exact moment he became dangerous. The consequences rippled outward immediately. Any lingering doubt among the elite that Nero might tolerate a rival claim to his throne was erased. The message, whether Nero intended it or not, was unmistakable. Anyone who threatened his position would not survive to become a real threat. It was a chilling preview of what was still to come. Let's look more closely at how this scene is described, because the details matter. According to Tacitus, the poison was administered at a family banquet, a setting where young Roman nobles, including Britannicus, would have had food and drink tasted in advance by servants as a standard precaution against exactly this kind of attack. The story goes that the poison was slipped into a drink after the tasted portion had already been approved, first serving Britannicus a harmless cup that passed inspection, then having a servant accidentally pour in cold water from a second, poisoned pitcher to cool it down, bypassing the safeguard entirely. Britannicus is said to have collapsed almost immediately, his body convulsing at the table in front of dozens of witnesses, including members of his own family. According to the account, Nero calmly remarked that Britannicus was merely suffering a seizure. He was known to have epilepsy, giving Nero a plausible, ready-made excuse, and the meal continued around the dying boy as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Picture that scene for a moment. A banquet hall full of Rome's elite, watching a young prince die in front of them, and not one person daring to react, because everyone in that room understood instinctively exactly what had just occurred, and exactly what would happen to anyone who said so out loud. Britannicus was quietly buried the following night in the rain, according to Tacitus. A hurried, almost furtive funeral for a boy who, under different circumstances, might have worn the crown himself. The reaction within the palace tells its own story. Octavia, Britannicus's own sister and Nero's wife, was forced to sit through the immediate aftermath of her brother's murder while betraying no visible reaction. Tacitus notes, with evident sympathy, that she had already learned, young as she was, the harsh lesson that survival in this family depended entirely on concealing exactly what you felt. Agrippina, too, reportedly understood the deeper message behind the killing, that her son was no longer willing to be guided or restrained, even by the mother who had placed him on the throne in the first place. Whatever illusions she may have still held about controlling her son's rule from behind the scenes, the death of Britannicus made clear that Nero was prepared to act decisively and violently against anyone he perceived as a threat, a lesson that would prove grimly relevant to her own fate before long. The political message could not have been clearer. Anyone who imagined that blood alone might one day give them a legitimate claim against Nero now had definitive proof of what such ambitions could cost. Because the next person Nero would be accused of eliminating would not be a stepbrother. It would be his own mother. Chapter 9. Murder of his mother. This is, without question, one of the most dramatic and disturbing chapters in the entire story of Rome. And we need to tell it carefully, because it says as much about Agrippina as it does about her son. Remember, Agrippina had built Nero's entire path to power. She had schemed, married, and possibly poisoned her way to placing her son on the throne. But power, once handed over, is rarely shared gracefully. And Agrippina, by all accounts, had no intention of stepping quietly into the background. She continued to involve herself deeply in imperial politics, expecting influence and deference befitting the woman who had made her son emperor. Nero, however, increasingly resented this. As he grew more confident in his own authority, and as his own inner circle turned against Agrippina, seeing her as a threat to their own influence over the young emperor, the relationship between mother and son curdled into open hostility. Constant arguments, public tension, a son trying desperately to carve out independence from the very woman who had built his entire life for him. Eventually, according to ancient historians, Nero decided his mother needed to die. What followed was one of the strangest assassination attempts in recorded history, the famous collapsing boat plot. The story goes that Nero arranged for a specially designed ship to fall apart while Agrippina was aboard, engineered to collapse and drown her at sea, disguised as a tragic accident. The plan failed. Agrippina, according to the accounts, survived the collapse and swam to safety. When the elaborate scheme fell apart, Nero, according to the ancient sources, abandoned subtlety altogether. He allegedly sent soldiers directly to finish the job. Agrippina was killed. Roman writers, composing their histories years after the fact, describe her final moments in vivid, dramatic detail, even claiming to know her exact last words. We should treat these details with real skepticism. No one present would have had reason, or likely the composure, to record her dying speech verbatim, and ancient historians were not above dramatizing a death for effect. What we can say with more confidence is this: the killing of one's own mother, matricide, was considered one of the most horrifying crimes imaginable in Roman society. A violation not just of law but of the sacred bond of family itself. An emperor who could do that to the woman who gave him everything was an emperor capable, in the eyes of Rome, of almost anything. Let's slow all the way down and walk through this night, because it is one of the most vividly described events in all of Roman history, and it deserves to be told properly. The setting was a festival at Baiae, a fashionable resort town on the Bay of Naples, famous among wealthy Romans for its hot springs and seaside villas. Nero invited his mother to join the celebrations, and by all accounts treated her with unusual warmth that evening, an affection ancient writers suggest was entirely performed, designed to lower her guard. After the festivities, Agrippina boarded a ship to return to her own villa along the coast. This was the specially constructed vessel, engineered, according to the ancient accounts, with a section of the roof rigged to collapse under the weight of lead, designed to crush her where she sat, or else pitch her into the sea where she would drown, all while appearing to any observer as nothing more than a tragic maritime accident. The mechanism worked, in part. The roof did collapse, but Agrippina, seated in a slightly protected position and shielded, according to the account, by the raised sides of her couch, survived the initial collapse. As the ship began to break apart and take on water, she reportedly swam to safety in the darkness, eventually reaching shore and making her way back to her own villa, shaken, but alive. Imagine the scene back at the palace when word reached Nero that the plan had failed, that his mother, the woman who had outmaneuvered emperors and rivals for decades, had once again survived an attempt to remove her. According to Tacitus, Nero was consumed with terror in the hours that followed, convinced that Agrippina would now move openly against him, rally soldiers, expose the plot publicly, and destroy him before he could destroy her. Panicked and no longer interested in subtlety, he turned to Tigellinus and his other loyalists, who devised a far blunter solution. Soldiers were dispatched directly to Agrippina's villa. According to the ancient accounts, when the soldiers arrived and moved to strike her down, Agrippina understood immediately what was happening and offered no plea for her own life. Instead, Roman writers claim she pointed to her own body and told the soldiers to strike her womb first, the place, symbolically, that had brought Nero into the world. We have to pause here and be honest with you about this detail specifically, because it's exactly the kind of dramatic flourish ancient historians love to add to their accounts. No soldier present that night would likely have survived to report her exact final words back to writers composing their histories years, sometimes decades, later. It's a haunting image, and it may well be pure invention, crafted to symbolize the horror of matricide in the most vivid way possible. What we can say with confidence is that Agrippina was killed that night, on her son's orders, and that, when Nero was informed, ancient sources claim he traveled to view her body himself, reportedly remarking coldly on her physical appearance, a detail meant to underscore just how completely he had detached himself from any remaining filial feeling. In Roman religious and cultural tradition, matricide sat in a category of horror almost entirely its own, a crime so unnatural that ancient mythology reserved some of its most terrifying punishments, the pursuit of the vengeful Furies themselves, specifically for those who killed their own mothers. For Nero to have crossed that particular line, in the eyes of Roman society, marked a point of no return. The public aftermath of the murder is almost as revealing as the act itself. Rather than attempting to hide what had happened, Nero's advisors crafted an official narrative claiming that Agrippina had been plotting to assassinate her son, and that the soldiers sent to her villa had acted in self-defense of the emperor, uncovering the plot just in time. A letter was sent to the Senate, laying out this version of events, and, in a detail that tells you everything about the political climate of the time, the Senate accepted it publicly, without meaningful challenge. Sacrifices of thanksgiving were reportedly offered in temples across the city, celebrating the emperor's narrow escape from his mother's supposed treachery. Ancient writers note this moment with real bitterness, pointing out that everyone in Rome's political class almost certainly understood the true version of events and chose, out of fear or self-preservation, to publicly endorse the lie anyway. It's a chilling illustration of exactly how much control an emperor could exert over the official record of events, even something as shocking as the killing of his own mother. And it foreshadows the deeper pattern of fear and complicity that would come to define the remainder of his reign. Tacitus records that Nero was tormented afterward by nightmares and visions of his mother's ghost, reportedly seeking out various rituals and even foreign mystics in an attempt to soothe his conscience. A detail that, whether literally true or a literary device meant to suggest a guilty conscience, adds a genuinely haunting dimension to the aftermath of the murder. It's worth noting that Nero did not return to Rome immediately after the killing. Suetonius records that he lingered in Campania for some time, reportedly anxious about how the city would receive him, before finally being persuaded that public sentiment, whatever people privately believed about the true circumstances of Agrippina's death, would not turn openly against him. When he did finally return, he was met, according to the official record at least, with celebratory crowds and honors befitting an emperor who had narrowly escaped a mother's treachery. A grotesque public performance of relief and gratitude staged over the reality of matricide that perhaps more than any other single moment captures just how thoroughly fear had already reshaped Roman public life around this young emperor's will. Chapter 10. His personal life. Nero's personal relationships tell a similarly dark story, at least according to the ancient writers who documented them. He was married 3 times. His first wife was Claudia Octavia, Claudius's own daughter, making her, in fact, Britannicus's sister. The marriage appears to have been political from the start, arranged to strengthen Nero's ties to the imperial family, and, by most ancient accounts, an unhappy one. Octavia's story, in particular, deserves to be told with real care, because ancient sources consistently portray her as one of the most sympathetic figures caught up in Nero's orbit, a young woman who, through no choice of her own, had already lost her father, her brother, and eventually her entire position in life, simply by being born into a family whose political value made her a pawn from the moment she could walk. She and Nero were married while both were still teenagers, an arrangement engineered entirely by Agrippina to cement Nero's claim to the throne, with little regard for whether the two of them were remotely suited to one another. Ancient writers describe the marriage as cold and loveless, almost from the start, with Nero reportedly showing little affection or attention toward his young wife, even in the early years of his reign. His second wife was Poppaea Sabina, a woman ancient sources describe as strikingly beautiful and deeply ambitious in her own right, reportedly already married to one of Nero's own close associates when their relationship began. Nero's relationship with her is often blamed, at least in part, for the end of his marriage to Octavia, who was eventually divorced on manufactured charges of infertility and adultery. Accusations ancient sources widely regard as fabricated to clear the way for Poppaea. Octavia was first exiled to the island of Pandateria, and then, according to Roman writers, put to death shortly afterward on Nero's orders, her severed head reportedly brought back to Rome at Poppaea's request. She was still only in her early 20s. The Roman public, by most accounts, was genuinely horrified by Octavia's fate. She had done nothing, as far as anyone could tell, to deserve such treatment beyond becoming inconvenient to her husband's new relationship, and her death marked one more step in Nero's gradual transformation, in the eyes of ordinary Romans, from a promising young ruler into a man capable of discarding even the most innocent people in his life without hesitation. His third wife was Statilia Messalina, who Nero married after Poppaea's death. And it's Poppaea's death that produces one of the most infamous and most disputed claims about Nero's entire life. Ancient writers allege that Nero, in a fit of rage, fatally kicked Poppaea while she was pregnant, killing her. We have to be honest with you about this story. It comes entirely from ancient sources that were, by this point in the narrative, deeply hostile to Nero, writing decades after his death, for audiences who already believed him to be a monster. It's entirely possible the story was exaggerated or invented outright to fit the image of Nero that later writers wanted to cement into history. Modern historians remain genuinely uncertain. What we can say is this: whether or not every specific detail is true, the fact that Roman writers found this story believable tells you everything about the reputation Nero had built for himself by the later years of his reign. There's another detail from this period that historians find genuinely fascinating, precisely because it complicates the simple image of Nero as a straightforward villain. After Poppaea's death, ancient sources report that Nero was overcome with what appears to have been real grief, commissioning an extraordinarily lavish funeral, having her body embalmed with spices in the manner of Eastern royalty rather than cremated in the traditional Roman style, and delivering a personal eulogy himself. Whether this grief coexisted with responsibility for her death, or whether the story of him causing it is itself an exaggeration by hostile sources, remains one of the many unresolved contradictions of his character. Later in his reign, ancient writers also describe Nero forming a relationship with a young man named Sporus, whom he reportedly had castrated and then formally married in a public ceremony, presenting him in the role of an empress. Roman sources treat this episode with open scandal and mockery, another example of Nero's willingness to disregard social convention entirely when it came to his personal desires. Taken together, these stories paint a portrait of a man whose private life had become as unpredictable and as boundary-breaking as his public rule, a man increasingly unwilling, or perhaps unable, to distinguish between his personal appetites and the dignity traditionally expected of the office he held. Chapter 11. The Great Fire of Rome. Now, we arrive at the centerpiece of Nero's entire story, the event most people, even today, associate with his name above all others. In July of 864, a fire broke out in Rome. It began, according to ancient accounts, in the shops surrounding the Circus Maximus, and from there, it spread with terrifying speed. Rome, at this time, was a city of cramped wooden apartment buildings, narrow winding streets, and virtually no organized firefighting system. Once the flames caught hold, they were almost impossible to stop. The fire burned for days. Entire districts of the city were reduced to ash. Of Rome's 14 administrative regions, ancient sources claim that only a handful escaped damage entirely, while several were utterly destroyed. Here's where the story gets genuinely complicated and where we have to slow down and be careful with the evidence. Popular legend holds that Nero started the fire deliberately, and that he played music on a fiddle while watching Rome burn. This image has survived for centuries. There's just one problem with it. The fiddle, as an instrument, didn't exist yet in the 1st century AD. That detail alone tells you how much legend has been layered on top of this story over the centuries. So, what do we actually know? Evidence that might suggest Nero's guilt. Some ancient writers claim he wanted to clear space in the city for his own building projects, and that he used the aftermath of the fire to seize land for his new palace. Rumors circulated at the time, even among his contemporaries, that his men had been seen assisting the flames rather than fighting them. Evidence against his guilt. Other sources note that Nero was reportedly away from Rome at his villa in Antium when the fire began, and rushed back to organize relief efforts once he learned of the disaster. He opened his own gardens to house the homeless, arranged for grain to be brought in at reduced prices, and implemented new building codes afterward, requiring wider streets and fire-resistant materials. Hardly the actions of a man simply reveling in destruction. Modern historians remain genuinely divided on this question. It's entirely possible the fire was a tragic accident, common enough in ancient cities, and that Nero's enemies later found it convenient to pin the blame on him. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because regardless of what actually caused the fire, Nero needed someone to blame. And according to ancient sources, he found his scapegoat in a small, unfamiliar religious sect that many Romans viewed with suspicion: the Christians. He accused them of starting the fire and unleashed brutal punishments against them. Executions carried out with theatrical, horrifying cruelty, according to the historian Tacitus. This moment marks one of the earliest large-scale persecutions of Christians in the Roman world, and it would echo through history for centuries afterward, long outlasting Nero's own reign. Let's walk through the fire itself in more detail, because the sheer scale of the disaster is almost impossible to overstate. It began, according to Tacitus, in the shops clustered around the southeastern end of the Circus Maximus. Merchants selling flammable goods packed tightly together in wooden stalls, in a district where narrow alleys wound between buildings that leaned so close together in places that sunlight barely reached the ground floor. Once a spark caught, there was almost nothing to stop it. Rome, in this era, had no organized fire brigade in the way we would recognize today. There was a corps of watchmen, the vigils, tasked with responding to fires, but they were poorly equipped for anything beyond small, contained blazes. Against a fire of this scale, fanned by summer winds and fed by densely packed wooden tenement buildings called insulae, cheap, multi-story apartment blocks where the vast majority of ordinary Romans lived, there was little anyone could do but run. The fire burned, with brief lulls and resurgences, for over a week. Tacitus describes flames leaping from rooftop to rooftop faster than people could flee, entire families trapped in buildings with no way out, ancient monuments and temples that had stood since the earliest days of the city reduced to smoking rubble. Of Rome's 14 districts, ancient accounts suggest 3 were completely destroyed and 7 more suffered severe damage, meaning the majority of the entire city was affected in some way. Try to imagine living through this as an ordinary resident of one of Rome's crowded tenement districts. You wake in the night to the smell of smoke, the sound of distant screaming growing closer, and you have only moments to decide whether to grab what little you own and run, or stay and hope the fire somehow spares your building. Ancient sources describe the roads out of the city choked with refugees, carrying what possessions they could salvage, families separated in the chaos and confusion, the elderly and the very young often left behind or lost entirely in the crush of people fleeing toward open ground. Tacitus notes that some people, in their desperation and grief, refused rescue altogether, choosing instead to remain and die alongside homes and belongings that represented their entire life's accumulated work. Now, here is where we need to slow down and examine the accusations against Nero with real care, because this is the single most contested question in his entire biography. The rumor that he started the fire deliberately seems to have begun circulating almost immediately, fueled by a number of unfortunate coincidences. He was said to have wanted to clear space for an ambitious new building project even before the fire broke out. Some witnesses reportedly claim to have seen men, allegedly acting on Nero's orders, carrying torches and obstructing efforts to fight the flames in certain districts. And the fact that his own new palace complex would eventually rise, in part, on land cleared by the disaster, struck many contemporaries as simply too convenient to be coincidence. Against this, we should weigh what we know of his actual response. Suetonius and Tacitus both record that Nero was at his villa in Antium, the same coastal town where he had been born, when the fire began, and that he returned to Rome only once it threatened the very heart of the city, including his own palace. Upon returning, he is credited with opening the Campus Martius and his own private gardens to shelter the newly homeless, arranging emergency food supplies and lowering the price of grain to prevent the disaster from tipping into mass starvation. In the fire's aftermath, he implemented genuinely sensible urban reforms. Wider streets to prevent flames from leaping so easily between buildings, height restrictions on new construction, and requirements that buildings incorporate fireproof materials wherever possible. These are not, on their face, the actions of a man who wanted his own capital reduced to ash. And modern historians studying the physical and circumstantial evidence increasingly lean toward the fire being an accident, a horrifyingly common occurrence in ancient cities built almost entirely from wood, packed at extraordinary density in an era before any modern understanding of fire prevention. But Nero's problem was that Rome did not need proof. Rome needed someone to blame, and rumors, once they take hold in a frightened, displaced population, are almost impossible to unwind through reason alone. And so, according to Tacitus, Nero moved to redirect the public's fury. He identified a small, unpopular religious sect within the city, a group whose members refused to participate in traditional Roman religious rites, whose beliefs were widely misunderstood, and who had few powerful defenders in Roman society. He accused them of starting the fire and unleashed a wave of punishment so brutal that even Tacitus, writing decades later for an audience with no particular sympathy toward this new religion, described it with evident horror. Christians reportedly wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in public spectacles, others crucified, and some, according to the account, set alight to serve as human torches illuminating Nero's own gardens after dark. It's worth adding one more layer to this debate, because modern historians and archaeologists have continued examining the physical evidence long after Tacitus and Suetonius put down their pens. Excavations in Rome have revealed layers of ash and burned debris consistent with a fire of the scale ancient writers described, lending physical support to the basic outline of the disaster, even if the precise cause remains impossible to establish through archaeology alone. Some modern scholars have pointed out that ancient cities suffered catastrophic accidental fires with genuine regularity. Rome itself had experienced serious fires before, under earlier emperors, without any accusations of arson attached to them, which lends weight to the accidental theory. Others note that the specific rumor of Nero fiddling while Rome burned, though anachronistic in its specific imagery, may reflect a real underlying tradition that he sang or performed during the crisis, behavior that, true or not, would certainly have fueled public outrage regardless of who or what actually caused the flames. Whatever the full truth about who or what actually caused the flames that summer, the persecution that followed represents one of the darkest chapters, not just in Nero's reign, but in the entire early history of Christianity. A moment when a new, still-forming religious movement first experienced the full, terrifying weight of Roman state violence turned against it. It's worth noting, too, that Christian tradition holds that both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul were executed in Rome during this same general period of persecution, an association that has tied Nero's name to Christian history for 2,000 years, long after the empire he ruled had crumbled into memory. Chapter 12. The Golden House. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero began construction on something almost unimaginable in scale, a new palace complex known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. To call it extravagant would be an understatement. Ancient descriptions speak of vast grounds encompassing an artificial lake, surrounded by gardens, porticos, and pavilions, all built across land freed up, conveniently in the eyes of his critics, by the fire's destruction. Inside, rooms were reportedly decorated with gold leaf, precious stones, and ivory. One dining room supposedly featured a rotating ceiling designed to mimic the movement of the heavens, sprinkling perfume down onto guests below. For a population that had just lost their homes, their neighborhoods, in some cases their entire livelihoods to the fire, watching their emperor build a private pleasure palace of this scale sent an unmistakable message about where his priorities truly lay. There's a famous line attributed to Romans of the time, joking bitterly that all of Rome was being swallowed by a single house. Whether or not that specific quip is authentic, the sentiment behind it almost certainly was. Luxury on one side of the city, suffering on the other. It was a contrast that would not be forgotten. Let's walk through what visitors to the Domus Aurea would actually have experienced, because the descriptions that survive are almost difficult to believe. The complex reportedly stretched across a vast portion of central Rome, incorporating hillsides, gardens, vineyards, and pasture land within the boundaries of the city itself. An extraordinary claim, given how densely populated Rome otherwise was. At its heart stood an artificial lake, surrounded by colonnades and pavilions designed to evoke the leisurely pleasure villas of the wealthy coastline, except transplanted directly into the capital of the empire. Suetonius describes a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, over 100 feet tall, standing at the entrance to the complex, a scale of self-glorification that had few precedents in Roman architecture up to that point. Inside, walls were reportedly covered in gold leaf and inlaid with gemstones and mother of pearl. Ceiling panels in the main banqueting hall were designed to slide open, showering guests below with flowers or perfume during meals. In that famous rotating dining room, mechanically engineered to turn slowly like the heavens themselves, mimicking the movement of the sky above the diners, represented an engineering achievement that ancient writers found almost as staggering as the extravagance itself. To fund construction on this scale, in a city still recovering from a catastrophic fire, Nero reportedly resorted to demanding contributions from the provinces, stripping temples of dedicated offerings and statues, and debasing the currency to stretch the treasury further than it could genuinely support. Governors in the provinces were pressured to squeeze additional taxes from populations who had, in some cases, only recently stopped grumbling about the last round of demands from the capital. Tacitus records that agents were sent throughout Italy, and the provinces specifically tasked with locating and confiscating valuable artworks and treasures, regardless of their religious or cultural significance to local populations, to help furnish the new palace's endless rooms. Entire temples, some centuries old, reportedly had statues and dedications stripped from them under this program, sparking quiet resentment across the empire from communities who had, for generations, regarded these objects as sacred rather than simply decorative. For ordinary Romans picking through the ashes of their old neighborhoods, watching this golden palace rise on land that, in some cases, had once held their own homes, the message was unmistakable, and it curdled whatever remaining goodwill still existed toward their emperor. This was not a leader rebuilding a wounded city for its people. This was a leader building himself a private paradise on the bones of a disaster his own subjects had barely survived. It's worth noting, too, that history would eventually have its own ironic response to the Domus Aurea. After Nero's death, his successors moved quickly to erase almost every trace of it, deliberately building over the site to bury the memory of his excess, including, generations later, the construction of the Colosseum itself on land that had once been Nero's private lake, transforming a symbol of one emperor's self-indulgence into one of Rome's most enduring public monuments. There's a particularly satisfying symmetry in that transformation worth dwelling on for a moment. Where Nero had drained a portion of the city's water and land to create a private lake for his own pleasure, visible to almost no one outside his own inner circle. The Flavian emperors who followed him deliberately filled that same ground with the largest public entertainment venue the ancient world had ever seen, a building explicitly designed for tens of thousands of ordinary Roman citizens to enjoy free of charge. It was, in effect, a calculated political statement carved directly into the landscape of the city, where the previous dynasty had hoarded space and luxury for itself. This one intended to give it back to the people. Even so, remnants of the Domus Aurea survived beneath later construction, buried and largely forgotten for centuries, until parts of it were rediscovered during the Renaissance, when artists, including Raphael, reportedly lowered themselves into the buried chambers by rope to study the surviving painted decorations by torchlight. Decorations that would go on to directly influence Renaissance art through a decorative style later named grotesque, after the underground grottos in which these rediscovered paintings were found. In a strange way, Nero's golden excess, buried and forgotten for over 1,000 years, ended up shaping the visual language of European art centuries after his death. Chapter 13. Nero, the Performer. If you want to understand just how deeply Nero broke with what Roman elites expected of an emperor, look no further than his obsession with performing. Nero loved to sing. He loved to act. He loved playing the lyre, a stringed instrument central to Roman musical performance. And crucially, he did not want to keep these passions private. He performed publicly. He competed formally in artistic competitions, insisting on being judged like any other performer. He reportedly traveled to Greece specifically to compete in festivals there, eager for recognition as a genuine artist rather than merely as a powerful man who dabbled in music. To a modern audience, this might sound almost charming, an emperor with genuine artistic passions. But to the Roman aristocracy of his time, this was deeply, almost unforgivably scandalous. Public performance was associated with actors and entertainers, a social class Roman elites considered beneath the dignity of a senator, let alone an emperor. For Nero to step onto a stage and perform for an audience, to be judged and applauded like a common entertainer, struck many in Rome's upper classes as a genuine embarrassment to the imperial office itself. Ancient sources describe audiences forced to sit through his performances, unable to leave even when bored or exhausted, because leaving in the middle of the emperor's performance could be interpreted as an insult. And insulting Nero was an increasingly dangerous thing to do. It's a small detail, in some ways, compared to murder and fire and palace intrigue. But it tells you something important. Nero, more than perhaps any other Roman emperor, seemed to genuinely crave recognition, not just as a ruler, but as an artist. And that craving would only deepen his isolation from the very class of Roman society whose support he would eventually need most. Consider his tour of Greece, undertaken late in his reign, which perfectly captures just how far Nero was willing to go in pursuit of artistic recognition. He traveled personally to compete in the great Greek festivals, the Olympic Games among them, entering competitions in music, poetry, and even chariot racing. According to Suetonius, the Olympic officials, likely under considerable political pressure, rearranged the traditional schedule of the Games entirely to accommodate his visit and awarded him victories even in events he reportedly failed to finish, including a chariot race in which he was thrown from the vehicle partway through the course. Nero returned to Rome afterward with, by some ancient accounts, well over 1,000 awarded prizes and crowns from these various competitions, and staged an elaborate triumphal procession to celebrate them, an honor traditionally reserved for military conquest, now repurposed to celebrate victories in singing and chariot racing. To the Roman aristocracy watching this unfold, the humiliation was almost unbearable. Military triumph had, for centuries, represented the pinnacle of Roman achievement, earned through blood and conquest on real battlefields. To see that same ceremonial honor bestowed upon an emperor for singing competitions, arranged and awarded through obvious political theater, struck many senators as a genuine degradation of everything Rome was supposed to represent. Ancient sources also describe audiences at his live performances enduring genuinely absurd lengths to avoid offending him. Suetonius claims that no one was permitted to leave the theater during his performances for any reason, resulting in stories of women reportedly giving birth in the audience rather than risk the emperor's anger by stepping out, and men feigning death so that they could be carried out on stretchers as the only acceptable excuse to escape. Whether every detail of these stories is precisely accurate, the broader picture they paint is consistent and telling. An emperor, so consumed by the desire for artistic validation that basic dignity and even basic human need became secondary considerations for those forced to witness his performances. There was a genuine political cost to all of this, beyond simple embarrassment. While Nero toured Greece chasing crowns for singing and chariot racing, the actual business of governing the empire was left largely unattended, with administrative matters and provincial concerns piling up back in Rome under the loose oversight of a freedman named Helius, whom Nero had left in charge during his absence. Ancient sources suggest that Helius eventually had to travel to Greece himself to warn Nero that conspiracies were brewing back in the capital, and that his prolonged absence was actively endangering his hold on power. A warning Nero reportedly resented, delaying his return even further before finally, reluctantly, sailing back to Rome. This detail matters enormously for understanding the collapse that followed. At the exact moment when steady, attentive leadership might have detected and diffused the growing discontent among the Senate, the military, and the provinces, Rome's emperor was instead abroad, chasing musical laurels, treating the machinery of empire as a secondary concern behind his own pursuit of artistic glory. By the time he returned and refocused on the practical business of ruling, the resentment that had been quietly accumulating in his absence had already hardened into something far more dangerous than simple grumbling. Chapter 14. Conspiracies. By this point in his reign, resentment against Nero had been building for years, among the Senate, among the aristocracy, among anyone who had watched murder, extravagance, and public humiliation pile up around the throne. That resentment eventually erupted into an organized plot, the Pisonian conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, the nobleman around whom the plot coalesced. A wide network of senators, equestrians, and military officers reportedly became involved, hoping to assassinate Nero and replace him with Piso. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out. What followed was a wave of brutal retribution. Executions, forced suicides, a practice common among the Roman elite, allowing the condemned to die by their own hand with some dignity rather than face public execution. Among those forced to take their own lives was Seneca, the very philosopher who had once tutored young Nero in the principles of Stoic restraint and moral virtue. Ancient sources describe his death with almost theatrical detail, portraying him facing the end with philosophical calm, in stark contrast to the chaotic cruelty of the emperor who had ordered it. The message sent by this wave of executions was unmistakable, and it spread fear through every level of Roman society. No one was safe. Not senators, not old friends, not even the man who had shaped Nero's own mind from childhood. Rome, once again, learn to live in fear of its own emperor. Let's look at how deep this conspiracy actually ran, because its scale reveals just how widespread opposition to Nero had become by this point. Ancient sources name senators, equestrians, military tribunes, and even members of the Praetorian Guard among the plotters, a genuine cross-section of Rome's ruling class, united by shared frustration with an emperor they viewed as unstable, extravagant, and dangerously unpredictable. The plot unraveled through a chain of small betrayals, as conspiracies so often do. A freedman, alerted to the plan by a nervous conspirator hoping to save his own patron, reported the scheme to Nero's agents. Once the interrogations began, the network of accusations spread rapidly, with some genuinely involved and others simply denounced by rivals eager to settle old scores under the cover of a real conspiracy. The resulting purge extended well beyond the original plotters. Nero used the conspiracy as justification to eliminate a number of prominent figures whose loyalty he had long questioned, whether or not they had any genuine connection to Piso's scheme. Seneca's death deserves particular attention, both for its historical significance and for how vividly ancient writers described it. Though the evidence directly tying Seneca to the conspiracy was thin, Nero, perhaps resentful of the man who had once governed in his name, perhaps simply eager to remove any voice that might still carry moral authority in Rome, ordered him to take his own life. Tacitus describes Seneca's final hours in remarkable, almost theatrical detail. The philosopher calmly comforting his grieving household, dictating final thoughts to secretaries, and, when the initial method of opening his veins proved too slow, ultimately dying in a heated bath, surrounded by attendants, meeting his end with the very stoic composure he had spent his life writing about and trying to instill in his former pupil. The contrast could not have been sharper. The teacher dying with philosophical calm at the emperor's command, the student increasingly erratic, surrounded by flatterers, ordering deaths not out of philosophical conviction, but out of fear and fury. News of these executions rippled outward through Roman society with devastating effect. Senators who might once have quietly grumbled about Nero's excesses now understood with total clarity that open criticism or even mere suspicion of disloyalty could mean death, no matter how distinguished or respected the accused might be. Among the other notable casualties of this purge was the poet Lucan, Seneca's own nephew, whose earlier friendship with Nero had soured into bitter rivalry, reportedly after the emperor grew jealous of his poetic talent and banned him from publishing further work. Forced to take his own life alongside the other condemned, Lucan reportedly spent his final moments reciting lines from his own epic poem describing a dying soldier, a final act of literary defiance from a man denied the chance to keep writing. The playwright and satirist Petronius, another prominent figure at Nero's court, and reportedly once a trusted arbiter of taste and style within the emperor's inner circle, was also caught up in the purge's aftermath, choosing to take his own life with a kind of theatrical, unhurried calm that ancient writers describe almost admiringly, sending Nero a final letter cataloging the emperor's own vices and scandals rather than the usual flattering praise expected in such circumstances. Rome, once again, learned to live in fear of its own emperor. And this time, the fear would not fade. It would only grow, feeding directly into the collapse that was now, quietly, already beginning. Chapter 15. Decline empires, like people, can only sustain excess for so long before the bill comes due. By the mid-160s AD, after years of lavish spending on games, on public entertainment, and above all on the endless construction of the Golden House, Nero's treasury was under severe strain. To keep the money flowing, taxation increased across the provinces, and the value of Roman currency itself was quietly debased, with less silver mixed into the coins minted under his rule. The provinces, already stretched thin, began to push back. Regional unrest and outright revolt started appearing in areas that had, for years, been reliably loyal to Rome. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the Senate's patience had worn dangerously thin. Years of executions, forced suicides, and public humiliations had eroded whatever goodwill remained between the emperor and the aristocratic class he needed in order to actually govern the empire. And, perhaps most dangerously of all, dissatisfaction was spreading through the military, the one institution an emperor could genuinely not afford to lose. Soldiers and their commanders had begun to question whether an emperor obsessed with singing competitions and palace decor was truly fit to command the loyalty of Rome's legions. Piece by piece, the foundation Nero had once stood on, popular adoration, senatorial cooperation, military loyalty, was crumbling beneath him. Let's look closer at just how severe the financial strain had become. Rebuilding Rome after the Great Fire was already an enormous undertaking, requiring resources far beyond what a normal imperial budget could easily absorb. Layer on top of that the staggering cost of the Domus Aurea, the continued funding of elaborate public games and artistic competitions, and gifts lavished on flatterers and performers who had curried favor with the emperor, and the strain on the treasury becomes obvious. To cover the shortfall, Nero's administration reportedly resorted to increasingly desperate measures. False accusations of treason leveled against wealthy citizens, whose estates could then be confiscated by the state. Pressure applied to provincial governors to extract additional revenue, regardless of the hardship this created for local populations already stretched thin, and a quiet debasement of Roman silver coinage, reducing the precious metal content in each coin while maintaining its face value. An ancient version of inflating the currency that would have been felt immediately by anyone trying to buy bread or pay rent with money that suddenly bought less than it used to. In the province of Judea, tensions that had been simmering for years over taxation, religious tensions, and heavy-handed Roman governance would soon boil over into the Jewish revolt, beginning in AD 66, a costly, drawn-out conflict that further drained military resources and imperial attention at precisely the moment Nero could least afford instability. Meanwhile, in Gaul and other Western provinces, governors who had once been reliably loyal began quietly testing the waters, gauging whether other military and political leaders might be willing to support a change in leadership. Word of Nero's growing unpopularity in Rome itself, his obsession with performance, his executions of respected figures like Seneca, his extravagant spending even as ordinary citizens faced rising costs, had spread throughout the empire, and ambitious men in the provinces began calculating whether the moment for rebellion had finally arrived. There's a particular irony worth noting here. The very legions whose loyalty Nero needed most were, by this point, largely stationed far from Rome, along distant frontiers, commanded by governors who had spent years watching the capital's political theater from a distance and drawing their own conclusions about their emperor's fitness to rule. Soldiers stationed on the Rhine and in Spain had never seen Nero perform on stage, never watched him compete in artistic festivals, but they had certainly heard the stories, carried along trade routes and military dispatches, of an emperor who seemed to value musical crowns over the traditional military virtues Roman legions had always respected in their commanders. Discipline within these frontier legions began to fray as confidence in the emperor's leadership eroded, creating exactly the conditions that ambitious governors like Galba would soon exploit. Chapter 16. Revolt. The end, when it came, arrived quickly. In the provinces, a governor named Galba began to openly position himself against Nero, gathering support from disaffected military and political figures who had simply had enough. Other governors soon followed, declaring their opposition to the increasingly isolated emperor back in Rome. Then came the blow that no emperor could survive. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose entire purpose was to protect the emperor's life, abandoned him. Without their loyalty, Nero had no real protection left at all. Sensing which way the wind was blowing, the Senate made its final decisive move. They formally declared Nero a public enemy of Rome, a declaration that stripped him of legal protection and effectively authorized anyone to kill him on sight. The boy who had once been welcomed to the throne with celebration, promise, and hope was now a hunted man in the very city he ruled. Let's trace exactly how quickly this collapse unfolded, because the speed of it is genuinely remarkable given how absolute Nero's power had seemed only months earlier. The first crack appeared in Gaul, where a provincial governor named Gaius Julius Vindex raised the banner of rebellion, publicly denouncing Nero's rule and calling for other governors to join him. Though Vindex's own forces were eventually defeated in battle, the rebellion had already served its true purpose. It demonstrated, openly, that opposition to Nero could be voiced without immediate, total destruction, and it emboldened other ambitious figures to consider their own options. Galba, governor of a province in Spain, was the one who capitalized most decisively on this opening. Already respected for his military experience and his connections among the old aristocracy, Galba allowed himself to be proclaimed emperor by his own troops, positioning himself as the legitimate alternative to a ruler increasingly seen, even by his own soldiers, as unfit to command. Back in Rome, Nero's response to the crisis reportedly bordered on the surreal. Ancient sources describe him initially dismissing the threat, more preoccupied with an upcoming artistic performance than with the growing military crisis unfolding across the empire. By the time he began taking the rebellion seriously, it was already far too late to mount an effective response. The Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers whose entire institutional purpose was to guarantee the emperor's safety, made the decisive move. Encouraged by their own prefect, and likely swayed by promises of reward from Galba's camp, they declared their support for the rebellion, effectively withdrawing their protection from Nero entirely. With the guard gone, the Senate saw its opening and moved with a speed that must have stunned even them. They formally declared Nero a public enemy, a designation known in Latin as being named hostis, an enemy of the Roman state, which stripped him of legal protection and effectively authorized any citizen to kill him without consequence. Overnight, the most powerful man in the world had become a fugitive, with almost no one left willing to protect him. It's worth pausing on just how isolated Nero had become by this point, because the isolation itself explains so much about how quickly everything unraveled. For years, he had surrounded himself almost exclusively with flatterers, performers, and loyalists like Tigellinus, who benefited directly from his continued rule while systematically alienating, exiling, or executing the more experienced, more independent-minded advisors who might otherwise have warned him just how precarious his position had become. When the crisis finally arrived, there was simply no one left in his inner circle with the standing, the honesty, or the political skill to help him respond effectively. Suetonius describes Nero in these final weeks oscillating wildly between denial and panic, at one point reportedly considering fleeing to the eastern provinces to rally loyal legions there, at another reportedly contemplating a dramatic public appeal to the Roman crowds, hoping his old popularity among ordinary citizens might yet save him. Neither plan was ever seriously executed. By the time he recognized the true severity of his situation, his own household staff had begun quietly abandoning the palace, taking valuables with them, leaving the emperor increasingly alone in rooms that had once been filled with courtiers competing for his attention. When the Senate's declaration finally reached him, Nero is said to have asked, almost in disbelief, what crime he had actually committed to deserve such treatment. A question that reveals, perhaps more than anything else in the entire final chapter of his life, just how deeply disconnected he had become from the reality of how his own reign was perceived by the people he had ruled. Chapter 17. Final Hours. What follows is one of the most quietly tragic endings in the entire history of Rome. With soldiers closing in and the Senate having turned against him completely, Nero fled the city, escaping to a villa belonging to one of his few remaining loyal freedmen just outside Rome. There, hiding, isolated, and terrified, the man who had once ruled the known world faced the reality that there was no escape left. Ancient sources describe him pacing, desperate, reportedly asking those around him to help him find the courage to take his own life rather than face capture and the public humiliation of execution that would surely follow. According to these accounts, he tried several times and could not bring himself to do it alone. Finally, with the help of a companion, some accounts name his secretary, Nero took his own life on June 9th, AD 68. Tradition holds that his final words were, "What an artist dies in me." We should tell you plainly, this quotation comes entirely from ancient historians writing after his death, and like so many dramatic final lines attributed to famous figures in antiquity, we cannot know with certainty that he actually said it. But true or invented, it captures something remarkably fitting about how Nero seemed to see himself until the very end, not primarily as a ruler, a son, or a husband, but as an artist, robbed of the recognition he always believed he deserved. He was 30 years old. Let's walk through those final hours slowly, because Suetonius's account, whatever its embellishments, remains one of the most haunting death scenes in all of Roman history. Fleeing Rome under cover of darkness, Nero was accompanied by only a handful of loyal freedmen, a stunning contrast to the crowds who had once cheered him at the games, the senators who had once flattered him at banquets, the soldiers who had once sworn to protect him with their lives. According to Suetonius, as they rode toward the villa of his freedman Phaon, Nero reportedly overheard soldiers nearby discussing the search for him and heard people in the streets already speculating about what punishment awaited him should he be captured. Roman law prescribed a particularly brutal traditional punishment for those declared public enemies, involving a wooden fork placed around the neck before being flogged to death, an ending almost too horrifying for even Nero to contemplate. Arriving at the villa, hidden and exhausted, Nero reportedly asked his companions to help him prepare a grave, muttering, according to the account, about what a great artist was about to perish. He asked those around him to demonstrate how to stab himself effectively, apparently unable to work up the courage to act alone, despite his evident terror at the alternative. As the sound of approaching horsemen grew closer, Nero, running out of time, finally found the resolve to act, with his secretary Epaphroditus reportedly assisting him in driving the blade home. According to Suetonius, a centurion arrived moments later, attempting to save him with a cloak pressed to the wound in hopes of presenting him alive, but it was already too late. Tradition holds that his final words were, "What an artist dies in me," a line that, true or invented, has echoed through nearly 2,000 years of retelling, precisely because it captures something so essential about how Nero seemed to understand his own life, not primarily as a story of political power, but as a story of unrecognized artistic greatness, cut short by a world that never appreciated him the way he believed he deserved. He was 30 years old, and with his death, an entire dynasty, one that had ruled Rome since the days of Augustus himself, spanning nearly a century, came to its end. Take a moment to consider the strange, quiet irony of that final scene, because it says something profound about how completely Nero's world had collapsed around him. This was a man who had once commanded legions across 3 continents, who had built himself a golden palace so vast it swallowed entire neighborhoods, who had forced senators and commoners alike to sit through his performances for hours rather than risk his displeasure. And in the end, he died in a borrowed room, in a house that was not his own, assisted by a secretary because he could not manage the final act alone, hunted by the very state apparatus he had once controlled entirely. Suetonius adds one more detail worth sitting with. As Nero prepared for the end, he reportedly recited a line of Greek poetry, expressing sorrow at losing skill and fame together in death. A final, almost pathetic reflection of the identity he had clung to more tightly than any other throughout his life. Not emperor, not son, not husband, artist above all else, right up until his very last breath. The centurion who arrived moments too late to save him reportedly reacted with genuine distress, having hoped to present Nero alive to whichever new regime was forming, understanding perhaps that a living emperor was worth infinitely more, politically, than a dead one. Nero, in this final act, denied Rome the theater of a public trial or execution, the humiliating spectacle the Senate's declaration had specifically authorized. In dying by his own hand, in private, he retained at least this one final small measure of control over the ending of his own story. Chapter 18. Aftermath. Nero's death brought the Julio-Claudian dynasty to an end. There would be no more emperors descended from the bloodline of Augustus. The family that had ruled Rome since the birth of the empire itself was simply, suddenly, over. What followed was chaos. In the space of a single year, 4 different men would claim the imperial throne in a period of brutal civil war historians now call the Year of the 4 Emperors, a stark demonstration of just how much instability Nero's fall had unleashed on the empire he left behind. Galba, the first to claim the throne after Nero's death, ruled only briefly before being murdered by his own soldiers, frustrated by his refusal to pay the donative, the customary cash reward he had promised them for their support. Otho, who orchestrated Galba's downfall, held power only a few months before being defeated in battle by forces loyal to Vitellius, a rival claimant backed by the legions stationed along the Rhine. Vitellius, in turn, was overthrown after only a few months of his own chaotic rule, as support swung decisively toward a respected general commanding forces in the east. The sheer speed of these successive collapses illustrates just how thin the foundations of imperial authority had become once the legitimacy of continuous Julio-Claudian bloodline rule was broken. For nearly a century, whatever the individual failings of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, or Nero himself, the underlying legitimacy of the ruling family had never seriously been questioned. Once that dynasty ended, Rome discovered, in the most violent way possible, that the empire's stability had depended more heavily on that unbroken bloodline than anyone had previously realized. Eventually, a general named Vespasian would emerge from that chaos, founding a new dynasty and restoring a measure of stability to Rome. Vespasian, notably, had actually served under Nero earlier in his career, commanding forces during the suppression of the Jewish revolt in Judea and his eventual rise to the throne, backed by the powerful legions under his command in the east, finally brought an end to the destructive cycle of short-lived, soldier-installed emperors that had defined the previous year. Under his new Flavian dynasty, Rome would enter a period of renewed stability, one that, fittingly, would come to include the construction of the Colosseum on the very ground once occupied by Nero's private lake. Interestingly, Nero's death did not immediately end his hold on the popular imagination. In the years following his suicide, several impostors emerged across the eastern provinces, each claiming to be Nero, insisting he had somehow survived and gone into hiding, and gathering genuine followings among ordinary people who remembered his subsidized games and his populist charm more fondly than the Senate ever had. This phenomenon became known to historians as the Nero Redivivus legend, Nero reborn, and it persisted for years, even decades, after his actual death, a strange testament to just how differently he was remembered by the common people of the empire compared to the aristocratic writers who would ultimately shape his historical reputation. But Nero's legacy did not fade quietly into history. If anything, it grew larger and darker with each passing generation. Roman historians writing decades after his death, men like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, whose accounts form the backbone of nearly everything we know about him, wrote for audiences who had every reason to want Nero remembered as a monster, a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power is placed in unstable hands. And so, the question we asked you at the very beginning of this story remains, even now, genuinely unresolved. Was Nero born evil, or did absolute power corrupt a boy who might otherwise have lived an unremarkable life? Was his mother, Agrippina, ultimately responsible for shaping the very monster she needed to control her son? Was there some deeper psychological unraveling happening within him, one we can only guess at from a distance of nearly 2,000 years? And how much of what we think we know about him was even true, versus the exaggerations, distortions, and political score settling of historians writing for audiences who already despised him? Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio remain our primary windows into Nero's life and reign. But none of them were neutral observers. All of them wrote under later emperors who had every political incentive to make the fallen Julio-Claudian dynasty look as monstrous as possible by comparison. Some stories about Nero are almost certainly true. Others were likely exaggerated. A few may have been invented entirely. What we can say for certain is this: whatever the full truth may be, Nero remains, 2,000 years later, one of history's most unforgettable rulers, a boy given absolute power, who became, for better or worse, one of the most talked about men who ever lived. Consider for a moment just how many different lenses we can view him through, and how differently he looks depending on which one we choose. Through the eyes of the Roman Senate, he was a tyrant who murdered his own family and humiliated the dignity of the imperial office. Through the eyes of ordinary Romans who packed the stands at his games and received his subsidized grain, he was, for years, a genuinely beloved ruler, mourned by some even after his death. Through the eyes of early Christians, he was the man who unleashed the first great imperial persecution against their faith, a horror that would be remembered for centuries as a symbol of Rome's capacity for cruelty. And through the eyes of Seneca, his old tutor, he may well have represented something even sadder, proof that all the philosophy in the world cannot always save a person from the corrupting weight of unchecked power. Perhaps the most honest answer to the question we began this story with: was Nero born evil, or was he made? Is that it was never really one or the other. He was born into a family that had already normalized poison, murder, and betrayal as ordinary tools of political survival. He was raised simultaneously by a mother whose love for him was inseparable from her ambition, and a philosopher whose teachings of restraint never quite had the chance to fully take root. He was handed absolute power at an age when most people are still discovering who they are, surrounded almost immediately by flatterers eager to profit from his worst instincts, and stripped, one by one, of the steady influences that might have kept those instincts in check. None of that excuses what he did. The murders, real or exaggerated, remain horrifying either way. The persecution of Christians left scars on history that lasted centuries. The extravagance, at the direct expense of a suffering population, remains a genuine moral failure by any standard, ancient or modern. And yet it's worth remembering, too, the other Nero, the one who existed simultaneously alongside the tyrant in the same body across the same 30 short years. The Nero who lowered taxes and funded games that brought genuine joy to hundreds of thousands of ordinary Romans. The Nero who opened his own gardens to shelter the homeless after the Great Fire, whatever his role in causing it. The Nero who, whatever his motives, genuinely seemed to love music and poetry and performance with a passion rare among rulers of any era, ancient or modern. History rarely deals in pure villains, and Nero's story, examined honestly, resists that simplification at nearly every turn. But understanding how Nero became Nero, tracing the path from that infant born in Antium, cursed by his own father, shaped by his mother's relentless ambition, tutored by a philosopher who tried and ultimately failed to instill restraint, gives us something more valuable than simple condemnation. It gives us a genuine window into how absolute power, combined with isolation, flattery, and a childhood built on political calculation rather than stability, can transform even a promising young ruler into one of history's most infamous names. And perhaps that's the real lesson worth carrying away from this story. Not simply that power corrupts, which is a truth almost too familiar to need retelling, but that the corruption rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one flatterer at a time, one silenced advisor at a time, one unpunished cruelty at a time, until the distance between the golden-haired boy the Senate once celebrated and the friendless fugitive dying in a borrowed villa no longer looks like a single dramatic fall, but the slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of 1,000 small surrenders. And that, in the end, might be exactly the kind of immortality he always wanted. It's worth pausing, too, on just how far Nero's name has traveled beyond the borders of ancient Rome itself. In the centuries since his death, Nero has become something close to shorthand in Western culture for a tyrannical, self-absorbed ruler, indifferent to the suffering of the people beneath him. The phrase, "fiddling while Rome burns," surviving in everyday language today, even among people who couldn't otherwise tell you a single fact about his actual reign. Painters of the Renaissance and beyond returned again and again to scenes from his life. The murder of Agrippina, the burning of Rome, the persecution of Christians, finding in his story a kind of endlessly reusable symbol for the corrupting nature of absolute power. Composers, novelists, and later filmmakers have continued to mine his reign for material, drawn to the sheer operatic scale of a story that combines matricide, arson, religious persecution, artistic obsession, and imperial collapse, all within a single 30-year lifespan. Few rulers in all of human history have left behind a name that functions so completely as its own cultural shorthand. A single word capable of instantly conjuring images of cruelty, excess, and civilization consumed by its own ruler's vanity. Whatever the full, complicated truth of the man himself, that legacy, for better or worse, has proven remarkably durable. Before we close, it's worth spending a little more time on something we've mentioned throughout this story, because it genuinely shapes everything you now know about Nero: the reliability of the men who wrote his history. Almost everything modern audiences know about Nero comes down to three ancient writers: Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. None of them lived through Nero's reign as adults recording events firsthand. Tacitus was likely a small child, if he had even been born yet, when Nero died. Suetonius was writing roughly half a century later. Cassius Dio composed his account even further removed, more than 100 years after Nero's suicide. All three were also writing under later emperors and dynasties who had strong political incentives to portray the fallen Julio-Claudian line, and especially its final ruler, in the worst possible light. Painting Nero as a uniquely monstrous tyrant conveniently justified the legitimacy of the dynasties that replaced him, allowing the Flavians and later rulers to present themselves as a necessary correction to Julio-Claudian excess, rather than simply the next set of ambitious men to seize power through force. This doesn't mean everything these historians wrote was false. Tacitus, in particular, is generally regarded by modern scholars as a careful, thoughtful historian who often explicitly notes when a claim is rumor rather than confirmed fact, and who sometimes presents multiple competing versions of events rather than simply picking the most scandalous one. Suetonius, writing in a more biographical, gossip-driven style, is often less careful about distinguishing rumor from fact, though his work remains an invaluable source of detail precisely because of how much he includes. Cassius Dio, writing latest of the three, sometimes preserves traditions the earlier writers omit, but is also furthest removed from any possibility of first-hand testimony. What all of this means for you, as someone hearing this story now, is this: some of what you've heard tonight is almost certainly true. The murder of Britannicus and Agrippina, the Great Fire, the persecution of Christians, the extravagance of the Domus Aurea, and the final collapse of his reign are all corroborated across multiple sources and are treated by most modern historians as substantially accurate, even if individual details were dramatized. Other elements, the exact wording of his father's curse, the specific final words of Agrippina, the precise circumstances of Poppaea's death, even his famous last line about dying as an artist, sit in a much murkier category, plausible but ultimately unverifiable, the kind of vivid detail ancient historians were prone to add for dramatic and moral effect. History, especially ancient history, rarely offers us a single, clean, indisputable truth. What it offers instead is a set of accounts, shaped by the biases and agendas of the people who wrote them, which we have to weigh, question, and interpret as carefully as we can. Nero's story is one of the best examples in the ancient world of exactly why that careful weighing matters, because the man who emerges from that process is far more complicated and far more human than the simple monster of popular legend. It's a useful habit, honestly, to carry with you well beyond this one story. Anytime you encounter a historical figure remembered almost entirely through the words of their enemies, or through accounts written generations after their death for audiences with their own political motivations, it's worth asking the same questions we've asked about Nero throughout this story. Who wrote this down? How long after the events did they write it? And what did they stand to gain by telling it one way rather than another? You won't always get a clean answer, but asking the question is often the difference between simply repeating a legend and genuinely understanding history. If you made it this far, thank you for watching the whole story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe for more deep dives like this one, and let me know in the comments what emperor or historical figure you want covered next.